20 years ago, on the morning of April 1st, 2001, a United States Navy EP-3 aircraft was conducting close-in reconnaissance on China, about 104 kilometres, 56.1 nautical miles, off the southeast coast of Hainan Island, and collided with the People's Liberation Army Navy J-8 fighter, which was on duty monitoring the aircraft. The collision resulted in the loss of the J-8 and the death of the Chinese pilot Wang Wei. The damaged EP-3 made an emergency landing at Linshui Airport, Hainan. The crisis was quickly resolved with an expression of US regret and China's release of the plane and crew after 11 days. Sino-US relations recovered quickly following the incident. However, the US military's frequent close-in reconnaissance sorties have remained an enduring source of tension in the Sino-US military relationship over the past 2 decades. Since 2009, the frequency and intensity of US close-in reconnaissance on China has increased significantly. The US conducts up to 2,000 reconnaissance flights in the Yellow Sea, East and South China Seas per year, whilst the nature of such sorties is evolving. In 2020, the SCSPI and open source intelligence analysts repeatedly found through ADS-B data that US reconnaissance aircraft have impersonated civilian aircraft from countries such as Malaysia and the Philippines by broadcasting spoofed ICAO hex codes whilst conducting reconnaissance flights near China's coast. For example, on the morning of September 8th, the US Air Force RC-135 Rivet Joint departed Kadena Air Force Base Okinawa for a reconnaissance mission over the South China Sea. After entering the Bashi Channel, the aircraft changed its mode S code to 750548 and disguised itself as a Malaysian airliner. On September 22nd, the US Air Force RC-135S Cobra Ball also took off from Kadena Air Force Base. After entering the LOC, changed the mode S code to 75C to impersonate a Philippine airliner and operated there for 5 hours. After completing the mission, it changed the code back to the real one. Presumably, the Cobra Ball was sent to monitor a PLA military exercise in the Yellow Sea. According to official data from Chinese authorities, the first 3 quarters of 2020 saw the US military perform more than 100 such flights over the South China Sea. The use of spoofed codes and masking military aircraft as civilian flights constitutes a problematic approach to reconnaissance missions and could result in a potentially serious incident. The use of civilian contractor reconnaissance aircraft for conducting close-in reconnaissance on China is a notable trend. Since March 2020, the US has been hiring several of them to monitor China, namely the Tenax Aerospace Bombardier CL-604, Lasai Aviation Bombardier CL-650, and Meta Special Aerospace King Air Beechcraft B-350, among which the Tenax CL-604 operates most frequently. The aircraft arrived at Kadena on March 31st, 2020 and left on March 17th, 2021. In its year-long deployment, it made a total of 250 reconnaissance flights to the Yellow, East and South China Seas almost on a daily basis. It is worth noting that, compared with large military reconnaissance aircraft such as the P-8A Poseidon, the contractor-operated reconnaissance aircraft retain their civilian markings. Moreover, considering the advantage of its compact size, wingspan and length are only half of the P-8, they are often less noticeable and more flexible when performing reconnaissance missions. Generally, after approaching the Chinese coastline, the CL-604 would gradually descend from an altitude of 20,000 feet to less than 5,000 feet or even 1,000 feet, utilising a low-altitude advantage to conduct high-intensity close-in reconnaissance on China. RQ-4 Global Hawk and MQ-4C Triton unmanned reconnaissance aircraft have been deployed to Andersen Air Force Base Guam. The MQ-4C especially conducts increasingly frequent operations which are spotted over the South China Sea every 2 to 3 days. According to the Japanese MOD, US Air Force RQ-4 and USN MQ-4C will temporarily deploy to Yokota Air Force Base, Japan from mid-May for about 5 months. By deploying to Japan, the Global Hawks and Tritons will be able to maintain a higher operational tempo in part due to the better weather in Japan in typhoon season compared to Guam. It also warrants mention that the use of unmanned air systems for strategic reconnaissance may result in a greater risk of inadvertent friction, due to, for example, the possibility of technical failure. At present, international law, including the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, have no explicit provisions against conducting such operations. Freedom of overflight is included within UNCLOS under the general provisions of freedom of the high seas. However, a number of UNCLOS provisions are subject to differing interpretations between states. When it comes to interactions between China and the US, China requests that the United States give due regard to China's rights and not impinge on China's national security, whilst the United States argues that the area beyond the territorial sea is international airspace where operations are unrestricted. The US military insists on conducting close-in reconnaissance, and the Chinese military usually takes countermeasures according to international practice, such as monitoring, accompanying, and intercepting. Whilst the US views conducting reconnaissance flights in international airspace as a routine military activity, China views such activities in peacetime as an unfriendly act and not consistent with its interpretation of the peaceful uses of the sea, the Charter of the United Nations, and general international laws and norms. Conversely, how would the US government and public view regular, sustained reconnaissance flights by a foreign power in proximity to the US? The only consensus between the US and Chinese militaries is to strengthen crisis management and avoid tensions escalating into military conflict. Given that the close-in reconnaissance and the countermeasures between the United States and China have increasingly intensified, the risk of an incident and inadvertent escalation is often present. Thus, it is very urgent for the governments and militaries of the two countries to draw up the necessary rules to control competition and avoid friction. In the next step, the two sides should conduct in-depth and pragmatic consultations and make every endeavour to form a series of operational codes of conduct for close-in reconnaissance and aerial encounters. Both sides need to have a certain strategic awareness and exercise necessary restraint. Whilst the United States will not end reconnaissance flights in proximity of China, it also needs to try to reduce the risk of military friction caused by close-in reconnaissance and be cognizant of how such flights are perceived in Beijing. It is of critical importance, both in terms of the bilateral relationship, regional and international security, that competition and tensions between the US and China be effectively managed and mechanisms be put in place to ensure that crises do not escalate into direct conflict. The consequences of conflict between China and the US would be of such magnitude that conflict must be avoided. This will require diplomacy and confidence building between both Washington and Beijing.